Hey there, good morning. Today, I want to talk about 4 things that you can think about when you are trying to figure out themes in your clients' play therapy sessions when you're using art. And the reason it's important to figure out the play therapy themes is because they give you information about what's going on with your client and how you can help them. The thing about recognizing themes is that it's a complex thing. So there's a few things to think about when you're trying to figure out what those themes are. And asking about themes is one of the biggest questions I get when I'm doing play therapy trainings and I'm providing play therapy supervision and consultation. The question I get asked all the time is, how do you figure out what the themes are? And it sounds like such an easy thing to answer, and it's not. And I found it to be complex because there are a variety of things you need to think about. And that's what I want to talk about today. So I'm Kathy Spooner. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a registered play therapist supervisor here in the United States. And I have been working with children, adolescents, and families in the mental health field for the past 30 years. And I love using play therapy and expressive arts. It is pretty much my primary modality because I work mostly with children, adolescents, and their families, a little bit with adults here and there. But play therapy is my primary modality that I use because it is so effective with children and adolescents. So if you're joining me live today, I would love to see who's here. Go ahead and post your name in the comments. Where are you from? What modalities do you use? Do you use art? Are you using play therapy? So I'd love to see who's here and why I am trying out this new thing. I got this intro, which I love because the music's really zippy. So I've been trying to try it out a little bit now that I've been doing this for a little while. So I will be right back. I don't know why that music just makes me happy. Anyway, so if you're here, I'd love to see who's here, and let's get to it. So I'm going to share 4 things that you need to think about when you are working with children and adolescents using a play therapy framework. So this is geared towards people using play therapy. And most people who are in the play therapy field, I'll be honest, I have yet to meet anybody that does not have art supplies. So, hey, Stephanie from Glasgow, that's awesome. Non-directive play therapy. Yes, I am actually one of my favorite play therapy models to use with the younger kids is child-centered play therapy, for sure. I love that. Well, welcome. I'm glad you're here. So I want to talk about 4 things to think about when you're using art or figuring out art themes in your client's artwork when you're providing play therapy. And the first thing that I think is important is to think about what is your play therapy model that you're using. So, for example, like Stephanie was saying, she uses non-directive play therapy. And the likelihood, Stephanie, you have art supplies in your playroom is probably pretty high. So the play therapy model that you're using is going to be grounded in theory, and theory drives application. So when I'm using child-centered play therapy, which is a non-directive play therapy modality, when I'm using child-centered play therapy, I'm going to conceptualize what they're doing with their art a little differently than, say, if somebody is using Jungian play therapy, because Jungian play therapy is going to be grounded in Jungian play therapy theory. And so the lens that you're using is influenced by the theoretical model that you're using. And that's an important thing to understand because it's the way your theoretical model influences the way in which you understand what's going on with your clients, understanding what they need to work through in their play therapy sessions, and the way in which you show up, your way of being with them in the session. So, like child-centered play therapy, my way of being with children when I'm using child-centered play therapy is much different than if I'm using a little more directive approach. There's some overlap because I would say child-centered play therapy is my default mode. Yes, Stephanie says lots of art supplies. I love using art. Welcome, Ursula. Both directive and non-directive. Yeah, me too. I would say I kind of use an integrated approach, and I would say child-centered play therapy I call it my default mode. It's that seminal play therapy model that I work from because I would say if I'm not using a child-centered play therapy approach, I am using more of a integrated approach that's rooted in attachment theory and neurobiology. So the neurobiology of attachment, and that's kind of how I conceptualize what's going on in many ways, and then I'll work through from there. And so the way that you're understanding the themes in the art is going to be influenced by your theoretical framework. So you want to make sure that you keep that in mind. And the other thing is, from a play therapy perspective, understanding the therapeutic powers of play is foundational to play therapy. So if you're not familiar with the therapeutic powers of play, they are the therapeutic aspects of play that your play therapy model will tap into to help children heal. So they're the therapeutic elements of play. And if you're interested in learning more, I'm years and years and years ago, like 20 years ago, I read Charles Schaefer's book, The Therapeutic Powers of Play. That one was published in 1993. And it was really good to read that book to get a good understanding of what these therapeutic powers of play are. And then in 2014, Dr. Charles Schaefer and Dr. Athena Drews did a second edition of that. So there's an updated version, and I have that one too. And it's still a really good book to read. And I really think if you're in the play therapy arena, that really is an important book to make sure that you read all the way through. I don't know if you guys are like me. I have like stacks of books, professional books everywhere that I'm reading through, because it helps you understand that foundational aspect of play therapy. And when you're using art in play therapy, art is an amazing way to tap into those therapeutic powers of play. So you can access the therapeutic powers of play through art. And so, for example, access to the unconscious. When you're using art, play therapy and art are projective modalities, which means they do access that unconscious. And if I'm using a neuroscience and attachment lens, I might say my internal working models, I might say mentalizations, but probably a universal term that we all know is unconscious. And so because it can kind of bypass cognitive understanding and get to some of those areas that we're working through, including children, then art is a really good way to be able to access what they may or may not, well, if it's unconscious, they're not going to understand. So get those unconscious elements will show up in their artwork. It shows up in their play, so it's going to show up in their art as well. And it gives you a little more insight from a clinical standpoint, what's going on with your clients. So then you can use that information to help you figure out, one, better understand your clients so you know what's going on with them. And if you have a better sense of what's going on with them, then you can, that's to me where your clinical decision making comes in, meaning what do I need to do? What interventions I need to use? Am I on track? And how do I help my client get through all the stages of the treatment process so that they can be successful, meaning they've overcome whatever challenge it is that they're experiencing. So another therapeutic power of play is creative problem solving. And so when they're using art, they're solving all kinds of things. They're figuring out what they want to create with their art. They're figuring out what art mediums they want to use. So, for example, do they want to use markers or crayons or colored pencils? In my playroom, I always have oil pastels, and because I like art, so I tend to try to have a few more art mediums in there. You also got to think about the age that you're working with as well. So if you're really just working with the really young kids, you probably want to limit what art supplies they have access to. And so so they're figuring all of those things out. How do they want to place things on their paper if they're making the art? What else are they going to put on there? What colors are they going to make things? All of those things, they are using creative problem solving. Another is counter conditioning. So one of the things that I love using art, I'll use sand tray as well. You can see all my sand tray miniatures behind me. But one of the things I love using for counter conditioning is if children are really struggling with nightmares and they're having trouble sleeping, or you're working with children who've experienced trauma, then you can use counter conditioning with art. One of the ways that I love to do that is I ask them to draw their nightmare. And then once they draw their nightmare, then I'll ask them to share as much or as little as they want. And if they're willing to share, then I get it. Then I get the story that goes with the nightmare. And then we can use some narrative type of techniques where you give voice to the characters in the nightmare that they've drawn. So in every nightmare, there's going to be a bad guy and a victim, so to speak. And so the way that I go through that process is I ask whatever they name it, I stick with that name. So it's really good to listen to the words that they're using because you want to use those words. And if they haven't named it, you don't want to name it. And so I'll just say bad guy for discussion's sake. So I'll say, well, I'm curious, what would the bad guy say to, I'll call it victim. I wouldn't call it that in real life, but just for the sake of discussion. So I'll say, well, I'm going to use a different term. I don't like that one. So what would the bad guy say to that guy? And then I'll have them give voice to the bad guy. And then I'll say, well, I wonder what that guy would like to say to the bad guy. And then they'll think about that and they'll give voice to that guy. And then I'll say, wow, I wonder what the bad guy would say back. And so they're having this dialogue. And eventually what happens is that guy feels a little more empowered in talking to the bad guy and finds his voice, so to speak, to say, no way, that's not going to happen. And then you can even, if they're up to it, if your client's willing to do all of this, then you can even say, well, I wonder what that guy would like the bad guy to do, or I wonder what would help that guy feel safe. And so they can add some of those elements if they want to into the drawing. So you can use some of those therapeutic powers of play in that way with the art to do some of that counter conditioning. And another therapeutic power of play, just for example, is self-expression. Self-expression, the way I think about it, is really feeling seen and heard and understood. That's the beauty of self-expression in a therapeutic situation. So we can use that self-expression within that therapeutic session in which you, as the therapist, the play therapist, have that therapeutic rapport with your client. You're providing that safe therapeutic space where they can explore all kinds of things. And you are bearing witness to what is unfolding with the client. You're holding that their therapeutic space for them to be able to do some exploration and use self-expression as a way for some of that exploration. And so accessing the therapeutic powers of play and understanding what these therapeutic powers of play are can give you an idea of what your client is working through and how they're working through it. And then that helps with some of your clinical decision making about what needs to happen. The other thing that I think is important when you are trying to figure out the themes in your clients' play therapy sessions, keeping in mind where they are developmentally. So a young child, cognitively, socially, emotionally, even physically, developmentally is going to be much different than like a 10-year-old. 4-year-olds are just figuring out how to use scissors, how to color. They don't stay within the lines. Their fine motor skills are much different than even a 7 or an 8-year-old. And those are all because art does use the hands, and they are using art mediums as a way for working through, that expression and exploration of what's going on with them. Even for self-soothing, I mean, emotion regulation and drawing and coloring, that's really nice, really soothing for your neurosystem. And so you want to think about the way in which a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, what's developmentally typical for a child that age versus maybe a 10 or an 11-year-old child. This gives you really good information about one, socially and emotionally where they might be, because a 10-year-old child who's more social emotionally along a 7 or a 6-year-old, the likelihood you're going to see some of that show up in the artwork is pretty high. The other thing is it also gives good information about maybe some processing things going on that haven't been identified. So probably a little background. My background is teaching special education. That's my bachelor's degree. So I taught children with emotional problems that were in elementary school. This was back in the 1980s. What that did, though, for me was I learned all kinds of things, not only about the way emotions impact one's development. So the kids that I worked with had emotional problems, seriously emotionally disturbed was the category. I hate that term, for the record. And also, it wasn't uncommon. I'll say that another way because it's like a double negative. Nor a lot of times what I would notice as a special education teacher in a self-contained classroom with 8 to 12 kids who all could not be successful in a regular education classroom because of their emotional problems, was that it wasn't uncommon. I did it again. It was that oftentimes they had some processing, some learning disabilities or some processing delays, and that impacted their self-esteem. It impacted their frustration, especially if it was not identified. So that, to me, that's one of the things. You also be aware of those things that you're looking for developmentally. And to me, that's one we don't really talk about very much. Think about those developmental considerations, and what you're seeing in that art making process will give you an idea of, one, socially and emotionally where they are, and two, maybe some physical delays or some processing delays, or other things that might not necessarily have been noticed. So developmental considerations is another one. And then the other thing is, if you're learning to identify themes in your clients' play therapy sessions, including their art, it's really important to get training and supervision or consultation. This is a lot of what I like to focus on when I'm providing online trainings and I'm providing online consultation. So I have an online consultation group. We meet twice a month. I also work with people one-on-one to do play therapy consultation or supervision. And a lot of what we do in those sessions is, with permission, we'll look at the art and we'll look at different themes that are present in that art. And then we take those themes that are identified and think about, well, how does that relate to what the client what is dealing with? And then what do you need to do to help them resolve that? Who needs to be involved in their treatment? Are your interventions effective? And having that information about what's going on in the themes really does help you to be able to get really amazing results for your clients, that they can overcome what's going on. And the training too, like I have an art, I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end, but one of the things I love doing is teaching how to use art in the play therapy session. So within a play therapy framework, and we look at all of these things. We look at how the therapeutic powers of play show up. We look at developmentally how things show up. And so in the training, I have lots of examples, and we kind of break down those examples to identify the themes and what's going on. So we practice. There's lots of practice recognizing the themes in the training, so that when you have that information and you go back and you use some of the interventions that I also teach a lot of different activities that you can use, but you'll also know how to make sense of what's going on with that, because I think that's an important part of the process, to be able to not only have the activities that you can use, what framework are you using with that? How are you making sense of what's going on with that? And to me, being able to recognize the themes means you want to make sure you've had some good training, that you're also working with somebody who's further along in the process, so like a supervisor in consultation, so that you have somebody helping you to take not only what's going on, but then how to hold that information, because play therapy is an expressive modality. Art is an expressive modality, which means there's going to be projective qualities to that. And learning how to hold that projective quality without, I call it, kind of psychologically stepping all over it with your own stuff, is a really important part of the process. So how do we understand and make sense of it? How do we tap into our own resonance circuitries, as Daniel Siegel would say, and understand what's going on in the session with your client, as well as recognizing those themes, we need to be able to understand what's me and what's not me. And that's part of that training and consultation supervision process as well. So that is it for today. I am going to just do a quick recap. So think about it. What play therapy model you're using may influences the way in which you understand what's going on. And I did forget to mention there are themes that overlap all the modalities. So, for example, grief and loss is a theme that will show up in your play therapy sessions if you're working with children who have experienced the death of a loved one or going through some very significant transitions, like maybe move to another state and they left behind friends and family. They'll experience that loss. Children who have been going through divorce, whose parents are divorced or separated, that's grief and loss. So that those themes will show up regardless of what model you're using. And what you'll typically see are themes of sadness, anger, safety. If it's the death of a loved one, you'll see themes of that. If it's divorce and loss, you'll probably see lots of relational things or more of the anger and the sadness. So those like will show up. And then what you're using your theoretical model to help you understand the like conceptualize what's going on and how to help them through that process. So, for example, child-centered play therapy is going to look a lot different in the application than maybe if I'm using an integrated approach with a 9-year-old and I'm using more of an attachment and neuroscience lens with some directive interventions in there. The themes are still the same. And then how I understand grief and loss from an attachment standpoint may be different slightly than if I'm understanding it from a cognitive behavioral standpoint. We still need to get them all the way through the process. The themes will still be there. And then what we do with that is what makes the difference. And another one would be if you are if you're working with a child who's experienced trauma, you're going to see similar things show up in the session. Like you will see safety and security, probably some anxiety, probably some sadness, and always you will see the question of why, working through why, that always comes up. And so those themes will show up in the playroom. They'll show up based on how your client is experiencing them and their specific life situations. So here's an example of what I mean by that. I can't tell you how many times I have worked with children at females, so girls, like young girls. And we are like, when I say young, I mean probably like elementary age or like third grade or below, but also like maybe fourth and fifth in there too. But so if parents are going through a divorce and they are sad about that, that's grief and loss for them. The way in which it shows up for them, a lot of times what I see in the playroom are working through, like if I'm using sand tray, it'll be lots of brides and grooms. In their artwork, they may be really working on finding ways to calm themselves, to I call it self-soothe. That's my DBT coming in there. How do I feel better? I feel terrible. I feel sad. So I want to draw things that make me happy. You can do directive themes with an older child. Like I may have them do a before and after picture. So what was life like before and what is life like after? And then you'll see what they're drawing in there. And then it's that idea of a picture is worth 1,000 words. You get a sense of how they're experiencing it. That's access to the unconscious, and self-expression can also be a little bit of cognitive restructuring in there. So that's where the art and recognizing the themes and understanding kind of how to make sense of those themes so that you know what to do with them, they do access those therapeutic powers of play. So understanding the therapeutic powers of play is another thing that's really important to recognize. And then the third thing is keep in mind those developmental aspects of art making and the developmental aspects of children and the way children show up in your playroom. If you see indications of a younger social emotional age in there than their chronological age, then you're going to be thinking about, I wonder what's going on with that. You may see in their artwork, some of those fine motor skills are not quite as developed. That might be an indication that there maybe some visual motor processing or different things like that. So you want to keep in mind the developmental aspect when you're working with children, because it can give you really good information. And then finally, to me, the thing that really helps to learn how to identify themes in your clients' play therapy sessions, and in particular, their art, is getting really good training that gives you the knowledge of what to look for and some practice doing it. And then also the supervision and consultation piece of it, so that you take what you've learned in the training and you can apply that information to your specific clients in the way in which your specific clients are showing up in the playroom. So that is it for today. If you're interested, I do have a training coming up. It's an online training. It's a live webinar. It's coming up on Saturday, September 17th. It's called Integrating Art into Play Therapy with Children and Teens. We look at a play therapy framework. We look at the developmental aspects. We look at lots and lots and lots of artwork to get a sense of what some of those things are that you're looking for. I go over how do you introduce the art? How do you process the art with your clients? What to say, what not to say? How do you therapeutically kind of hold that process so that you're able to create and maintain a safe therapeutic art making space? We look at different art mediums and how those are experienced differently, questions you can ask, how you ask them. That's huge. For me, it's big how you ask and how you process so it maintains that safe space is really, really important. And then lots and lots of activities you can use for different mental health issues going on with your clients. So if you're interested in the training, it is, you can find out more on my website, which is rrhcounseling.com/courses. There's two versions. One has continuing education credits and one does not. So you want to make sure you register with the one that meets your needs. So one does have continuing education hours that are applicable here in the US. They may be applicable outside the US. I'm not really sure. If you have questions about it, please feel free to message me. If you found this information helpful, please like and share it across your social medias. And I will see you next week. Bye.